The Howling Griffons are one of the hardest Space Marine chapters to paint. The paint scheme has two infamous colours, red and yellow, in a quartered scheme. I wanted to paint something different to break up my army painting, which can get boring quickly. Maybe this was the wrong choice. The yellow alone took 3 coats before it looked anything close to right. I tried a new metallic recipe that looked patchy. The touch-ups needed to be touched up. This was meant to be a fun model to paint, but somehow I saved it. Yellow is known for its awful coverage, so I started with it. This meant I could be messy and I wouldn't have to cover other paints. I airbrush the mid-tone as it's easier and quicker to build up the colour with this technique. It can be difficult to build up a solid opacity. The more layers you need increases the chance of creating texture on the model. The model was primed with Hyrax Brown from Colourforge, because it's a good recess colour for warm colours like reds and yellows. I used overbrushing to build up the colour. Overbrushing is like dry brushing, but you leave more paint on your brush, so you paint more of the model, just leaving the recesses showing. I used Avalon Sunset from Citadel for this, but any similar yellow will work. The first coat looked rubbish, so I had to go over everything again, and the third time for a lot of areas. I wasn't bothered that this stage looked messy, because I'll paint over it with the other colours later. I started to dry brush the yellow areas with a nice yellow. I used Dawn Yellow from Games Workshop. I concentrated on the areas that would receive the most light, the head and the right shoulder. These highlights start to add more definition to the model, especially in places like the backpack, where yellow had been painted in some of the recesses. The heavier dry brush around the head and shoulders makes these areas brighter, drawing the eye to the head. The downward facing surfaces weren't highlighted as a minimal amount of light would hit these areas. But I already knew going back to touch up the yellow later was going to be a headache. Then I moved on to the red. Red covers better than yellow, so it's easier to cover any yellow on the red half using this colour second. I used Mephiston Red from Citadel as the base coat. Any bright red from all companies will look the same once it's finished. Red has the same coverage problem as yellow, so it took a while to build up a good colour with the red. I had to go over most of the areas a second time to build up a nice colour. You can see the line between the two is messy, but it's fine because I'll tidy this up later at the end in case I spill other paint on it. Then I dry brushed the red quarters with Wild Rider Red. I focused on the same areas as the yellow, the head, left shoulder and upward facing surfaces, so the light source felt consistent across the whole model. This technique is a godsend with Primaris armour. There are so many extra panels and edges, I'll be here all day without it. If it's done well, it's difficult to tell the difference too. The border between the two colours still needs some work, but before I fixed it, I nearly ruined the whole model. If you want to try dry brushing, click the bestsellers link in the description to browse our dry brushing sets. I wanted to try a new recipe for the metals I'd seen on Warhammer Community. I base coat the weapons and other metallic areas with lead belcher, using 2 thin coats to get a smooth and solid base coat. Then I washed everything with watered down silicon grey, a grey contrast paint. The idea sounded interesting. The recesses will be a dark grey rather than a brown if I used Agrax Earthshade, but this suffered like all contrast paints do. On the large flat surfaces, it was patchy because there was no recesses for it to run into. I painted the bodysuit with Black Legion because it had good coverage but still creates subtle highlights. I used the same paint on the weapon casings too, which hid a lot of patchiness from the earlier wash. The weapons were starting to look better. I applied quick edge highlights to the holster and the Quila. Then I used Knott's Hobbies weathering sponges to sponge on some scratchy highlights with Runefang Steel. The contrast paint wash didn't work, but I liked the sponge chipping. I base coat the holster and belt with Warp Fiend Grey instead of brown because this contrasts nicely with the red and yellow armour. I followed it with a wash of Rhinox Hide. I love this colour and it's a close match to the primer, keeping a similar recess colour to the rest of the model. I applied some quick highlights with Administratum Grey to define the shapes again. To paint the eyes, I base coated them with Wraithbone first instead of white, because this paint has great coverage. Then I painted a layer of Athematic Blue, which naturally gives some variation to the eyes and pops against the armour. I start to touch up the O first, painting any areas that were meant to be yellow but weren't. I start with the base coat, working from the easiest areas to the harder ones, like the line between the red and yellow. I then added highlights with Dawn Yellow. At this point, I'd rather paint too much yellow than not enough, because it can be touched up next. I then followed the same process with the reds, using Mephiston Red, then Wild Rider Red, using the geometry of the model to help me paint a line halfway through each panel. The model was finished, but it wasn't perfect. You can see where I've touched up the armour and the weapons are an experiment gone wrong, but there's still time to save it. A base can make or break a model. I base coat the base with red and black. I'm going to do a city base because it will pop against the armour. I painted a white line with raised bone to add some road markings to the tarmac. This needed a few coats. At this stage I can go back and touch up the black. I dry brush the base with colourless black to start to build up the texture. If I get some on the white, it's not a problem because it will break up the line so you can't tell if it's not perfectly straight. Then I added a light dry brush of ash and grey to add some extra colour and brighten up the black. The model looked okay and most people will stop here. With an extra 10 or 15 minutes, I can save this model. I had a look in my bits box to see what I could find. I found some cables and a spare helmet. I cut the cables to be shorter and glued them to the base. After that, I ripped some cork into a small piece, cut it into a thin slice, and cut a couple of straight edges. This was glued to the base to make it look like rubble from a damaged building. I cut off part of the helmet at an angle, drilled a bullet hole with a pin vise and added more damage with a hobby knife. I glued this to the base too. Nothing's painted yet, but it is starting to look better. I base coated the cork first with ash and grain, the same colour I used to dry brush the base. I used 2 thin coats, but I'm not worried if it isn't smooth. Then the cables and helmet were painted with cast iron green. I used the same colour on both, so it doesn't look too busy. The base should frame the model, not distract from it. The additional items were washed with mud oil wash from Nod's Hobbies. It naturally runs into the recesses to shade everything. Once this had dried, I dry brushed the same bits with Walt Fiend Grey because I used it earlier on the model. This gives the helmet and cables a dusty look which adds to the story I'm trying to tell. You can see the difference those extra touches made. Click the link for free painting guides in the description to get our free base and blueprint. The Howling Griffons aren't unpaintable, but they are very difficult to do well. But with some patience and a few additional bits to the base, you can get there. This one looks better than I was expecting. If you want to know how to improve your faces, click the video here. We'll find out if you can apply fine art techniques to miniature painting.